The small hands that pulled the lever on March 3, 1851, belonged to a child who had just turned 9 years old 2 weeks earlier. Thomas Wade, Jr. stood on a wooden crate beside the gallows platform in the Missouri Territory Courthouse, his father's massive hand covering his own, as together they released the mechanism that would send convicted murderer Samuel Briggs plummeting through the trapdoor to his death. The crowd of nearly 300 people fell silent as the rope went taut, with a sound like a whip crack echoing off the limestone walls. Young Thomas neither flinched nor looked away. He watched with the same steady gaze he would maintain through 31 more executions over the next 6 years, earning him a place in history as the youngest person to ever serve as an official executioner in the United States. What drove a father to force his own son into such a grotesque apprenticeship remains one of the darkest chapters in American judicial history. A story buried in courthouse records and private journals for over a century. The town of Bent Creek, Missouri had never intended to employ a child as its executioner. When Judge Cornelius Wade arrived in the spring of 1847 to establish law and order in the lawless territory, he brought with him his wife Margaret and their 5-year-old son Thomas, Jr., a quiet boy with his mother's gentle features and his father's penetrating gray eyes. Cornelius Wade was not merely a judge, but a man possessed by a philosophy so twisted that even the rough frontier folk who had seen their share of violence would come to regard him with a mixture of fear and revulsion. He believed that moral education could only be achieved through direct confrontation with the consequences of sin, and that children, being closer to a state of natural innocence, were the ideal instruments for delivering divine justice. The Wade family settled into a 2-story house at the edge of town, close enough to the courthouse that young Thomas could hear the proceedings through his bedroom window on quiet afternoons. Margaret Wade, a woman of fragile constitution who had married Cornelius when she was barely 16, spent her days teaching Thomas his letters and numbers while trying to shield him from his father's increasingly extreme views on justice and morality. She had seen the change in her husband since they'd left Philadelphia. Watched as the power of life and death had transformed him from a stern but fair man into something she could barely recognize. The frontier had a way of stripping away the veneer of civilization, revealing what lay beneath. And in Cornelius Wade's case, what lay beneath was a darkness that would consume not just his own soul, but that of his innocent son. The transformation of Thomas Wade, Jr. from a normal child into an instrument of state-sanctioned death began gradually. His father started by bringing him to witness executions when he was just 6 years old, holding the boy on his shoulders so he could see over the crowd. While other children were learning to fish or helping with farm chores, Thomas was being lectured on the nature of sin and the necessity of punishment. Cornelius would quiz his son afterward, asking him to describe what he had seen, how the condemned man had behaved, whether justice had been properly served. If Thomas showed any sign of distress or sympathy for the executed, his father would lock him in the cellar without food until he could recite, word for word, the biblical justifications for capital punishment that Cornelius had drilled into him. The cellar of the Wade house became young Thomas's second classroom, a dank space where he would spend hours memorizing passages from Leviticus and Deuteronomy by candlelight. The walls were lined with his father's extensive library of legal texts and theological treatises, but also with something far more disturbing: detailed sketches of execution methods throughout history, from crucifixion to burning at the stake, each annotated with notes about their effectiveness in delivering both punishment and moral instruction to observers. Thomas learned to read from these texts, his earliest education consisting of descriptions of suffering that would have horrified any normal parent. Margaret Wade attempted to intervene, but her protests were met with increasing violence from her husband. She confided to her sister in a letter that would not be discovered until decades later that Cornelius had begun to view their son not as a child to be nurtured, but as an experiment in moral education. "He speaks of Thomas as if he were fashioning a tool," she wrote, her handwriting shaky with emotion, "something pure and untainted that can deliver God's judgment without the corruption of adult conscience. When I begged him to let Thomas play with other children, he struck me and said isolation was necessary to preserve the boy's innocence. I fear what my husband is creating, but I am powerless to stop it." By the age of 7, Thomas was accompanying his father to the courthouse daily, sitting in a special chair beside the judge's bench, observing every trial with an attention span unusual for a child his age. Cornelius had trained him to take notes on the proceedings, and Thomas's careful handwriting filled notebook after notebook with observations about testimony, evidence, and the demeanor of the accused. The other officials initially protested the presence of a child during such grim proceedings, but Cornelius Wade held absolute authority in Bent Creek, appointed directly by the territorial governor, and none dared challenge him openly. The town's previous executioner, a man named Josiah Hedrick, had died of cholera in the winter of 1850, leaving the position vacant at a time when the territory was seeing an increase in violent crime. Gold had been discovered in the nearby hills, bringing an influx of prospectors, gamblers, and criminals. The jail was constantly full, and the gallows saw regular use. Several men had applied for the executioner's position, but Cornelius Wade rejected them all, claiming they lacked the moral purity necessary for such a sacred duty. It was during this period that he began to formulate his most disturbing plan. The first indication of what Cornelius intended came during the trial of Samuel Briggs, a drifter who had murdered a family of homesteaders for their horses and supplies. The evidence was overwhelming, and the sentence of death by hanging was delivered swiftly. As the execution date approached, however, Cornelius made an announcement that shocked even the hardened residents of Bent Creek. His son Thomas would serve as deputy executioner, learning the trade from his father in preparation for assuming the role himself. "The boy needs to understand the weight of justice," Cornelius declared from the bench, "and there is no better education than practical experience." Sheriff William Brennan, a veteran of the Mexican War who had seen plenty of death in his 43 years, approached Cornelius privately to voice his objections. That evening's confrontation was witnessed by Deputy Marcus Hull, who later recorded the exchange in his personal diary. Sheriff Brennan called the judge's plan an abomination against nature and threatened to report it to the territorial governor. Cornelius responded by producing documents that granted him extraordinary powers in the administration of justice, papers that Brennan suspected were forged but could not prove. The judge then made it clear that anyone who opposed him would find themselves on the wrong side of the law, and in a territory where Cornelius Wade was the law, that was a dangerous place to be. Young Thomas seemed unaware of the controversy surrounding his new role. He had been so thoroughly conditioned by his father that he accepted the responsibility with the same dutiful obedience he showed in all things. In the days leading up to the Briggs execution, Cornelius taught him the mechanics of hanging, using a weighted sack to demonstrate how to calculate the proper drop length based on the condemned's weight and build. Thomas practiced tying the noose, his small fingers struggling with the thick rope until he could form the 13 traditional coils with perfect precision. His mother watched from her bedroom window, tears streaming down her face, but she dared not interfere. The execution of Samuel Briggs marked a turning point, not just in Thomas's life, but in the moral fabric of Bent Creek itself. The crowd that gathered that cold March morning was larger than usual, drawn by the morbid curiosity of seeing a child participate in an execution. Some came to protest, others to witness what they were certain would be the judge's downfall when word reached the proper authorities. But Cornelius had calculated correctly that the isolation of the frontier and the general lawlessness of the period would shield him from immediate consequences. As young Thomas helped release the trapdoor that sent Briggs to his death, something changed in the boy's eyes, a light extinguished, or perhaps a darkness kindled. The second execution came just 3 weeks later. William Red McCarthy, convicted of killing a saloon owner during a robbery, was to be hanged on March 24, 1851. This time, Cornelius announced that Thomas would operate the mechanism alone, though he would stand nearby to supervise. The boy had grown in those 3 weeks. Not physically, but in some indefinable way that made those who looked at him uncomfortable. He no longer played or laughed, spending his free time reading his father's books on anatomy and law. Margaret Wade had stopped leaving her room entirely, claiming illness, though many suspected she simply could not bear to see what her son was becoming. The execution of Red McCarthy went flawlessly from a technical standpoint. Thomas, standing on his wooden crate, pulled the lever with a steady hand that betrayed no emotion. The condemned man dropped cleanly, his neck breaking instantly, a merciful death by the standards of the time. But those who witnessed it would later speak of the unsettling calm on the child's face. The way he watched McCarthy's final moments with what appeared to be clinical interest rather than horror or sadness. Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, the minister's wife, fainted at the sight and had to be carried from the courthouse grounds. Her husband, Reverend Paul Morrison, attempted to speak with Cornelius about the spiritual damage being inflicted on young Thomas, but the judge dismissed him with a lecture on divine justice that twisted Scripture into almost unrecognizable form. The third execution, that of Jacob Mills in April 1851, provided the first sign that Thomas was beginning to embrace his role with disturbing enthusiasm. Mills, convicted of raping and murdering a teenage girl, was widely despised, and his execution drew the largest crowd yet. Thomas had begun keeping his own journal by this time, documenting each execution with meticulous detail. His entry for the Mills hanging, discovered years later hidden in the walls of the Wade house, revealed a mind that had moved beyond simple obedience to his father's will. The subject struggled more than the previous two, he wrote in his neat child's handwriting. The drop was insufficient to break the neck cleanly, resulting in strangulation over approximately 4 minutes. I observed the progressive stages of asphyxiation with interest. The face purples in predictable patterns. Next time, I will recommend a longer drop for men of similar build. What disturbed readers of Thomas's journal even more than his clinical descriptions was the personal notes he added about the condemned men. He seemed to take pride in being the last person many of them would see, the one whose hand would send them to their fate. "I am their final judge," he wrote after his 5th execution. "Father says the court determines guilt, but I determine the moment and manner of their passing. This is a sacred power that few adults possess, and none so young as I. The other boys in town fear me now. This is as it should be. Justice must be feared to be respected." By the summer of 1851, Thomas had presided over 8 executions, and word of the boy executioner had begun to spread beyond Bent Creek. Newspaper reporters from St. Louis and even Chicago arrived to witness what one called the most disturbing perversion of childhood innocence in the American territories. But Cornelius Wade had been careful to ensure that everything was done within the letter of the law, if not its spirit. There were no statutes preventing a child from serving as executioner, particularly when supervised by a legal authority. The reporters who came expecting to expose a crime found instead a perfectly legal atrocity, a corruption of justice that existed within its very framework. The effect on young Thomas was becoming increasingly apparent. Dr. Ezekiel Hayes, the town's physician, noted in his medical records that the boy had developed unusual symptoms. He slept no more than 3 or 4 hours a night, spending the dark hours reading or practicing knots. His appetite had diminished to the point where his clothes hung loose on his thin frame. Most disturbing were what Dr. Hayes described as episodes of dissociation, moments where Thomas would stare into space with dilated pupils, his lips moving as if in conversation with someone only he could see. When asked about these episodes, Thomas claimed he was discussing justice with the men he had executed, learning from them about the nature of guilt and punishment. The relationship between Thomas and his father had evolved from one of domination to something more akin to collaboration. Cornelius began consulting his son on matters of sentencing, asking for his opinion on which condemned men deserved mercy and which required the harshest punishment. Thomas's recommendations were invariably severe, often more so than his father's initial inclinations. In one recorded instance, when Cornelius considered commuting the sentence of a young horse thief to imprisonment, Thomas argued successfully that consistency in punishment was essential to maintaining the fear necessary for social order. The thief, barely 18 years old himself, was hanged the following week with Thomas at the lever. Margaret Wade's condition deteriorated rapidly through the summer of 1851. Dr. Hayes's records indicate that she was suffering from what he termed nervous exhaustion, though modern readers might recognize the symptoms of severe depression and anxiety. She attempted suicide twice, once by taking an overdose of laudanum and once by trying to throw herself from the courthouse roof. Both times she was prevented, and both times Cornelius used the incidents as teaching moments for Thomas, explaining that his mother's weakness of spirit was exactly why strong moral guidance was necessary. Women and weak men cannot bear the weight of justice, he told his son. That is why God has chosen us for this burden. The arrival of a federal marshal in September 1851 briefly raised hopes that someone would finally intervene. Marshal Jonathan Cross had been sent to investigate reports of irregularities in the territorial justice system, and the story of the child executioner had reached the ears of officials in Washington. Cross, a stern man who had served with distinction in the war with Mexico, was not easily shocked, but what he found in Bent Creek tested even his composure. He attended an execution on September 15th, watching as 9-year-old Thomas efficiently dispatched a convicted murderer named Charles Booth. The marshal's report, filed with the Department of Justice, described the scene as grotesque beyond words. A child transformed into an automaton of death by a father whose zealotry has crossed into madness. However, Marshal Cross found himself constrained by the same legal technicalities that had protected Cornelius Wade thus far. The judge had been careful to document everything to ensure that each execution was properly authorized and witnessed. There were no laws specifically prohibiting a child from serving as executioner, and attempting to remove Cornelius from his position would require evidence of actual legal wrongdoing rather than moral repugnance. Cross attempted to speak with Thomas privately, hoping to find evidence of coercion or abuse that could justify intervention, but the boy proved unnervingly composed and articulate in defending his role. The conversation between Marshal Cross and Thomas Wade, Jr., recorded in Cross's report, provides chilling insight into how thoroughly the child had internalized his father's philosophy. When asked if he understood what death meant, Thomas replied that death was the mechanism by which sin was purged from the world. When pressed about whether he felt sadness for the men he executed, he seemed puzzled by the question, asking why he should feel sadness for implementing God's will. Most disturbing was his response when Cross asked if he ever wanted to play with other children or have a normal childhood. "I am not a normal child," Thomas said matter-of-factly. "I have been chosen for a special purpose. Other children play at being soldiers or cowboys. I do not play at justice. I am justice." The fall of 1851 brought a series of executions that would test even Thomas's conditioned detachment. A gang of outlaws had been captured after robbing a stagecoach and killing 3 passengers, including a pregnant woman. All 5 men were sentenced to hang on the same day, October 31st, in what would be the largest mass execution in the territory's history. Cornelius saw this as an opportunity for Thomas to demonstrate his full capabilities, announcing that his son would conduct all 5 executions in sequence without assistance. The logistical challenge of executing 5 men in succession required careful planning, and Thomas threw himself into the preparation with disturbing enthusiasm. He calculated drop lengths for each man, practiced the timing needed to reset the gallows between executions, and even suggested modifications to the platform that would allow for more efficient processing of the condemned. His journal from this period reads like a technical manual, with detailed diagrams and timetables that would be impressive from an adult executioner, let alone a 9-year-old child. The morning of October 31st dawned gray and cold, with a crowd of nearly 500 people gathered despite the weather. Word of the mass execution had spread throughout the territory, and many had come specifically to see the child executioner at work. Some came in protest, including a group of ministers from neighboring towns who attempted to block access to the gallows, but they were quickly dispersed by Sheriff Brennan's deputies. Others came with morbid fascination, eager to witness what newspapers were calling the most disturbing spectacle in American justice. Thomas conducted the executions with mechanical precision. The first man, James Crawford, dropped at exactly 10:00 a.m. By 10:47 a.m., all 5 outlaws were dead, their bodies arranged in a row beneath the gallows. Thomas had managed the entire process without hesitation or error, moving from one execution to the next with the efficiency of a craftsman completing a familiar task. But witnesses noticed something that would haunt many of them for years afterward. As the last man dropped, Thomas smiled. It was not a smile of cruelty or satisfaction, but something worse. The simple pleasure of a job well done. The kind of smile any child might wear after successfully completing a difficult assignment. The mass execution marked the beginning of Thomas's transformation from his father's tool into something more autonomous and perhaps more dangerous. He began making suggestions for improvements to the justice system that went beyond mere execution methods. He proposed a classification system for crimes that would standardize sentencing, removing what he called the inefficiency of judicial discretion. He designed new restraints for prisoners that would prevent escape attempts while maximizing discomfort, arguing that suffering before execution was an essential part of the punishment process. Most disturbing, he began identifying potential criminals before they had committed crimes, creating lists of townsfolk whose behavior or appearance suggested criminal tendencies. Cornelius Wade, far from being concerned by his son's evolution, saw it as vindication of his theories. He began writing a treatise on moral education through exposure to justice, using Thomas as his primary example. The boy has achieved a purity of purpose that most men never attain, he wrote. Unencumbered by false sympathy or misguided mercy, he sees justice as the mathematical equation it truly is. Crime equals punishment. Sin equals death. That he has achieved this clarity at such a young age proves that childhood, properly guided, can be the perfect state for moral absolutism. The winter of 1851 to 1852 was particularly harsh, and crime in the territory increased as desperate men turned to theft and violence to survive. Thomas conducted 12 executions during those cold months, including 2 women convicted of murdering their husbands. The execution of women was controversial even in that harsh time and place. But Thomas showed no more emotion hanging Mary Patterson and Sarah Coleman than he had with any male prisoner. His journal entry for Mary Patterson's execution noted only that female prisoners required different calculations for drop length due to typically lighter body weight and more delicate neck structure. It was during this period that Thomas began experiencing what Dr. Hayes described as episodes of somnambulism. Margaret Wade, in one of her few coherent conversations with the doctor, reported that she would find Thomas in various parts of the house at night, standing perfectly still with his eyes open, but apparently asleep. On several occasions, she found him in the cellar going through the motions of conducting an execution with an invisible prisoner. His lips would move in what seemed to be conversation, and he would pull an imaginary lever with the same precise motion he used on the actual gallows. When awakened, he would have no memory of these episodes, but would sometimes mention having dreams about talking with the men he had executed. The psychological toll on Margaret Wade reached a breaking point in January 1852. Unable to bear watching her son's continued transformation, she attempted to poison both Thomas and herself with arsenic she had obtained from the general store, ostensibly for killing rats. Thomas, whether through luck or some preternatural awareness, did not drink the poisoned tea she had prepared. Margaret consumed her portion and spent 3 days in agony before dying on January 18th, 1852. Her death was officially recorded as accidental poisoning, though many suspected the truth. Thomas attended his mother's funeral with the same detached composure he displayed at executions, standing beside his father with dry eyes while the minister spoke of tragedy and God's mysterious ways. The death of Margaret Wade removed the last restraint, however minimal, on Cornelius's plans for his son. He began speaking openly of Thomas as his successor, not just as executioner, but as judge, envisioning a dynasty of Wade judges who would bring his philosophy of absolute justice to the entire American frontier. He started teaching Thomas law in earnest, having him sit through trials and write opinions on cases. The boy proved to have a sharp legal mind, quickly grasping complex precedents and procedures. But his interpretations of law were invariably harsh, always favoring the maximum possible punishment and showing no consideration for extenuating circumstances. The spring of 1852 brought an unexpected challenge to the Wade system of justice. A new territorial governor, appointed by President Fillmore, arrived with explicit instructions to investigate reports of irregularities in the administration of justice in Bent Creek. Governor Harrison Blackwood was a reformer who had campaigned against capital punishment in his native Pennsylvania, and the story of the child executioner had reached him as exactly the kind of frontier barbarism he had been sent to eliminate. Unlike Marshall Cross, Blackwood had the authority to remove judges and appoint replacements, and he made it clear from his first day in the territory that changes would be coming. The confrontation between Governor Blackwood and Judge Wade took place on April 3rd, 1852, in the courthouse where so many men had been sentenced to die. Blackwood, accompanied by a secretary and 2 federal marshals, presented Cornelius with an order removing him from the bench pending a full investigation into his conduct. Cornelius responded with characteristic defiance, producing documents and precedents that he claimed superseded the governor's authority. The legal argument continued for hours, with young Thomas sitting silently in his usual chair, watching the proceedings with his unsettling calm. It was Thomas who broke the stalemate, though not in a way anyone expected. Rising from his chair, the 9-year-old boy addressed Governor Blackwood with a composure that belied his age. He argued, citing specific cases and statutes, that removing his father would create a legal vacuum that would result in chaos and increased crime. He presented statistics on crime reduction since he had begun serving as executioner, demonstrating a correlation that even Blackwood had to admit was compelling. Most remarkably, he offered a compromise. He would cease serving as executioner if his father was allowed to remain as judge, sacrificing his own position to preserve what he called the stability of the legal system. Governor Blackwood, despite his reformist ideals, found himself outmaneuvered by a 9-year-old boy whose understanding of law and human psychology exceeded that of many adults. The compromise Thomas proposed was politically palatable, allowing Blackwood to claim victory in ending the scandal of the child executioner while avoiding the potential chaos of removing a sitting judge. The agreement was formalized on April 10, 1852, with Thomas Wade, Jr. officially retiring from his position as executioner after having conducted 31 executions over 13 months. But the story of Thomas Wade, Jr. did not end with his retirement from the gallows. The boy who had been shaped into an instrument of death could not simply return to a normal childhood that had never existed for him in the first place. Without the structure and purpose that executions had provided, Thomas began to deteriorate in ways that alarmed even his father. He stopped eating almost entirely, spending days in his room reading and rereading his execution journals. He began having violent episodes where he would attack furniture or walls with his bare hands, bloodying his knuckles and screaming about justice delayed being justice denied. Dr. Hayes, attempting to treat what he called acute nervous exhaustion, prescribed various remedies including laudanum and mercury treatments, but nothing seemed to reach the boy who had traveled so far from normal human experience. In his medical notes, Hayes wrote that Thomas seemed to be suffering from a fundamental disconnection from reality, unable to process a world where his unique purpose had been taken away. The child had been transformed into a tool for a specific function, and without that function, he had no identity or reason to exist. The situation became critical in June 1852, when Thomas attempted to hang himself in the cellar where he had spent so many hours studying his father's books. He was discovered by Sheriff Brennan, who had come to discuss a legal matter with Judge Wade. The sheriff cut Thomas down just in time, finding the boy unconscious but still breathing. When revived, Thomas expressed not relief but disappointment, stating that he had wanted to experience execution from the perspective of the condemned to complete his understanding of the process. "It was the logical conclusion of my education," he told Dr. Hayes. "I have delivered death 31 times. It seemed only fair that I should receive it once." Cornelius Wade, faced with the complete breakdown of his son, finally began to question the wisdom of his experiment. His journal from this period, discovered after his death, reveals a man grappling with the possibility that he had destroyed his son in pursuit of an ideological goal. "I sought to create the perfect instrument of justice," he wrote. "But I may have created something that cannot exist in a world that requires mercy as well as judgment." Thomas understands death, but not life. Punishment, but not redemption. "I have given him knowledge that no child should possess and taken from him the innocence that might have allowed him to bear it." The decision to send Thomas away was made in July 1852. Cornelius, using his remaining influence and considerable financial resources, arranged for his son to be admitted to a private sanatorium in upstate New York that specialized in treating children with nervous conditions. The facility, run by Dr. Friedrich Zimmermann, a German-born alienist who had studied the emerging field of child psychology in Vienna, represented one of the few places in America equipped to deal with a case as extreme as Thomas Wade, Jr. The boy departed Bent Creek on July 20th, 1852, never to return. The records from the Zimmermann Sanatorium provide the final documented chapter of Thomas Wade, Jr.'s story. Dr. Zimmermann's detailed case notes, preserved in the archives of the New York State Medical Society, describe a child unlike any he had encountered in 30 years of practice. Thomas arrived at the facility in a state of complete withdrawal, refusing to speak or acknowledge the presence of others. He would stand for hours at his window, moving his hand in the precise motion of pulling the gallows lever, counting softly to himself in a pattern that corresponded to his 31 executions. Treatment proved extraordinarily difficult. Thomas resisted all attempts at conventional therapy, viewing the doctors and staff as criminals attempting to corrupt the purity of his purpose. He kept detailed notes on other patients and staff, identifying what he perceived as their crimes and the appropriate punishments. These notes, written in his characteristic neat handwriting, assigned death sentences to nearly everyone in the facility for offenses ranging from lying to impure thoughts, which he claimed to be able to detect through observation of facial expressions and body language. Dr. Zimmermann attempted various treatments, including hydrotherapy, occupational therapy, and even experimental techniques involving hypnosis and electrical stimulation. Nothing seemed to penetrate the psychological fortress Thomas had built around himself. The boy would engage in conversation only when discussing matters of law and justice, showing remarkable intellectual capacity but complete absence of normal emotional response. He could recite entire legal codes from memory, debate complex, philosophical points about the nature of guilt and innocence, but could not engage in simple childhood activities or form basic human connections. The most revealing insights into Thomas's psychological state came from a series of drawings he produced during art therapy sessions. The images, rendered with disturbing technical skill, depicted scenes of execution in elaborate detail. But as the sessions progressed, the drawings became increasingly abstract, showing not actual gallows or condemned men, but geometric patterns that seemed to represent the concept of justice itself, as Thomas understood it. These patterns, analyzed decades later by psychiatric researchers, showed a mind that had abstracted human experience into pure ideology, unable to see people as anything more than embodiments of guilt or innocence. In September 1853, Thomas made his final escape attempt, not from the sanatorium, but from life itself. He had been collecting small pieces of rope from various sources around the facility, hiding them in his mattress. On the night of September 15th, exactly 2 years after he had watched Marshall Cross witness his execution of Charles Booth, Thomas constructed a noose with his characteristic precision and attempted once more to hang himself. This time, he succeeded in his goal before staff could intervene, dying at the age of 11 years and 7 months. Dr. Zimmermann's final notes on the case express both professional frustration and human tragedy. "The child died as he lived," he wrote, "with technical precision and absence of fear. He left a note containing only legal citations justifying suicide under specific circumstances of dishonor and loss of purpose. There was no mention of his father, no expression of regret or sorrow, only a final argument for the justice of his own execution. In death, as in life, Thomas Wade, Jr. remained the perfect instrument his father had created, incapable of being anything else. The aftermath of Thomas Wade Jr.'s story rippled through American legal and medical communities for generations. Cornelius Wade, broken by his son's death and the magnitude of his own actions, resigned from the bench and disappeared into obscurity. Some reports placed him in California during the gold rush, others in Mexico, but no confirmed sightings ever emerged. The last documentary evidence of his existence is a letter to Dr. Zimmerman, dated October 1853, containing only the line, "I killed my son long before he died." The town of Bent Creek attempted to erase the memory of its child executioner, destroying the gallows and converting the courthouse into a general store. But the story persisted in local memory, passed down through generations as a warning about the dangers of absolute justice and the corruption of innocence. The Wade house stood empty for years, considered cursed by locals, before burning down in mysterious circumstances in 1867. Among the ruins, investigators found Thomas's execution journals, which had been hidden in the walls, providing the detailed documentation that would allow historians to piece together the full story decades later. The legal implications of the Thomas Wade Jr. case contributed to significant reforms in territorial and state laws regarding the involvement of minors in judicial proceedings. By 1860, most states had enacted specific legislation prohibiting anyone under the age of 18 from serving in any capacity related to capital punishment. The Wade case was cited in numerous legal texts as an example of how the absence of specific prohibitions could allow for monstrous interpretations of law and the necessity of protecting children from adult responsibilities regardless of their apparent capacity to handle them. Medical professionals, particularly those in the emerging field of child psychology, studied the Wade case extensively. Dr. Zimmerman published a landmark paper in 1855 titled The Destruction of Childhood, a study in forced moral development, which used Thomas's case to argue for the critical importance of play, innocence, and gradual moral development in healthy child psychology. The paper influenced a generation of child development theorists and contributed to changing attitudes about childhood education and the importance of protecting children from premature exposure to adult realities. The execution records from Bent Creek during Thomas's tenure as executioner reveal statistical anomalies that researchers have puzzled over for years. The 31 men executed by Thomas had an unusually high rate of last-minute confessions, with 23 of them admitting to additional crimes not previously known to authorities. Some historians attribute this to the psychological impact of facing a child executioner, suggesting that the cognitive dissonance of being killed by a child prompted unusual honesty. Others propose that Thomas's unwavering calm and clinical approach created a confessional atmosphere different from the emotional chaos typical of executions. Several of the condemned men left behind written accounts of their final interactions with Thomas, and these documents provide chilling insights into the boy's psychological state. William Harrison, executed for murder in December 1851, wrote that Thomas had visited him the night before his execution to discuss the technical aspects of hanging with the enthusiasm of a student preparing for an examination. "He asked me how I preferred to fall," Harrison wrote, "whether I wanted a long or short drop, as if he were a tailor asking about the fit of a suit. When I cursed him for his coldness, he seemed genuinely puzzled, asking why I would be angry at someone simply performing their appointed function." The mystery of how Cornelius Wade conceived his horrific experiment has been the subject of much speculation. Research into his background revealed a brilliant but troubled man who had lost his own father to execution when he was 12 years old. His father, Marcus Wade, had been hanged for treason during the War of 1812, proclaimed innocent by many, but executed nonetheless. Some psychological historians suggest that Cornelius's transformation of his son into an executioner was a twisted attempt to gain control over the force that had destroyed his own childhood, making his son the master of the mechanism that had made him an orphan. The religious implications of the Wade case sparked fierce debate among theologians and ministers. Reverend Morrison, who had attempted to intervene during Thomas's tenure as executioner, published a series of sermons arguing that the case represented a fundamental perversion of Christian justice, replacing mercy and redemption with mechanical retribution. Other religious leaders, particularly those from more fundamentalist denominations, argued that Thomas Wade, Jr. had achieved a kind of terrible purity, becoming an angel of death uncorrupted by human weakness. These debates contributed to broader discussions about the role of religion in American justice that continue to this day. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of Thomas Wade, Jr. lies not in legal reforms or psychological theories, but in the question of what he might have become under different circumstances. The intelligence, focus, and analytical capability he displayed, properly nurtured, could have produced a brilliant legal mind, a pioneering scientist, or a gifted artist. Instead, these qualities were channeled into a grotesque parody of justice that destroyed not only the boy himself, but challenged fundamental assumptions about childhood, morality, and the limits of human conditioning. The final documentary evidence relating to Thomas Wade, Jr. emerged in 1923 when the Zimmerman Sanatorium was demolished. Workers discovered a hidden cache of letters that Thomas had written but never sent, addressed to the men he had executed. In these letters, Thomas engaged in lengthy philosophical discussions with his victims, debating points of law, questioning their guilt or innocence, and seeking their approval for the manner of their deaths. The letters reveal a desperate attempt to create human connection with the only people Thomas felt he truly understood, those he had killed. The last letter, apparently written the day before his suicide, was addressed to himself, arguing the case for his own execution with the same clinical precision he had applied to others. Modern forensic psychologists who have studied the Wade case often point to it as one of the earliest documented examples of what would later be understood as induced sociopathy. Thomas was not born without empathy or moral feeling, they argue, but had these capacities systematically destroyed through careful conditioning. The case remains required reading in many criminal psychology programs as an extreme example of how environmental factors can fundamentally alter personality development, particularly in children whose neural plasticity makes them vulnerable to radical reshaping. The town of Bent Creek, now part of modern-day Jefferson County, Missouri, has no official memorial or recognition of the events that occurred there between 1851 and 1852. The courthouse where Thomas conducted his executions was demolished in 1892, and the site is now a parking lot for a shopping center. But locals still speak of seeing a small figure on foggy mornings, standing where the gallows once stood, moving his hand in a pulling motion while counting softly to 31. Whether these are ghost stories or merely the persistence of historical trauma in collective memory remains a matter of interpretation. The question that haunts historians and psychologists studying the Wade case is whether Thomas retained any remnant of the normal child he might have been. Dr. Zimmerman believed he saw glimpses of it in unguarded moments. A flash of fear when thunder struck, a momentary softening when a therapy dog was brought to the facility. But these moments, if they existed at all, were fleeting and quickly suppressed by the rigid, psychological architecture Cornelius Wade had constructed in his son's mind. Thomas Wade, Jr. died as he had lived for the last 2 years of his short life, as the perfect instrument of absolute justice, incapable of mercy even for himself. The broader implications of the Thomas Wade Jr. story extend beyond the specific horrors of his individual case to fundamental questions about justice, childhood, and the limits of human malleability. Can a child be held responsible for actions taken under absolute parental authority? Was Thomas a victim or a perpetrator? These questions have no easy answers, and the Wade case continues to challenge comfortable assumptions about innocence, guilt, and the nature of evil itself. What remains clear is that in the pursuit of perfect justice, Cornelius Wade created perfect injustice, destroying his son's humanity in an attempt to make him superhuman. Recent archaeological work at the site of the Wade house has uncovered additional artifacts that shed new light on the story. Among the findings were toys that had belonged to Thomas before his transformation, simple wooden horses, and soldiers that showed signs of frequent use. These objects, dating from before 1847, suggest that Thomas had once been a normal child who played and imagined like any other. The contrast between these innocent toys and the execution journals found in the same excavation provides a poignant reminder of the childhood that was stolen from Thomas Wade Jr., replaced with a grotesque parody of adult responsibility. The legal doctrine that emerged from the Wade case, sometimes referred to as the Wade Protocol, establishes strict limitations on the involvement of minors in any aspect of criminal justice beyond serving as witnesses when necessary. This protocol, adopted by all 50 states by 1900, specifically prohibits minors from participating in executions, sentencing decisions, or any official capacity that involves determining or implementing criminal punishment. The protocol stands as a legal monument to Thomas Wade Jr., protecting other children from the fate that befell him. In the archives of the Missouri Historical Society, there exists a single photograph believed to show Thomas Wade Jr., taken by a traveling photographer in December 1851. The image shows a small, thin boy standing beside a much taller man, presumed to be his father. Thomas's face is turned slightly away from the camera, his expression unreadable, his hands clasped in front of him in a pose that seems both childlike and unnaturally formal. It is the only known visual record of America's youngest executioner, a boy who was robbed of his childhood and transformed into something that should never have existed. The story of Thomas Wade Jr. serves as a dark reminder of the capacity for human beings to corrupt innocence in service of ideology. It challenges us to consider the limits of parental authority, the nature of justice, and the fundamental rights of children to be protected from adult responsibilities and horrors. In forcing his son to become an instrument of death, Cornelius Wade revealed the dangers of absolute conviction and the terrible price of pursuing perfect justice in an imperfect world. Thomas Wade Jr. paid that price with his humanity, his childhood, and ultimately his life, leaving behind a legacy that continues to haunt our understanding of justice, mercy, and the sacred boundaries that must protect childhood innocence.